Thank you so much, Georgia. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. Can you hear me okay? Perfect. Okay. So I'm going to start with a quote. I like starting my sessions with quotes, so you'll probably see a few of them here. The Maori word for land is penua, also means placenta. All life is seen as being born from the womb of Papatuanuku under the sea. The lands that appear above water are placentas from her womb. They float, forming islands. In Maori tradition and history, the Papatuanuku, the Earth Mother, is seen as the birthplace of all things in the world and a place to which they return. I want to start tonight's session by recognizing the knowledge and long-standing traditions of Indigenous cultures in this country and all over the globe. Much of the local or Indigenous knowledge regarding land stewardship is hidden, overshadowed by modern science, and overwhelmed by global economic development. And in a lot of ways, aspects of modern soil science derived from traditional knowledge. For cultures to be viable over thousands of years, they need to be resilient and responsive to changes. Many cultures rely on sensory perception, but also on careful observations of the soil and the natural features of the Earth's surface. These cultures have gone through their successes and failures. They can provide long term insights about human responses to global environmental change and uncertainties such as the climate and desertification. Their methods have been time tested, dynamic, creative, and have operated much longer than modern soil science. So, going back to this quote, we can also get a sense of the spiritual connection that Indigenous cultures have with their land. So, one of the practices that we can adopt from Indigenous cultures is bringing together the environmental inputs gathered by our sensory stimuli. So, having a more holistic version of what we receive from our senses, not just the things that we see, but also the things that we smell, hear, feel, and even taste. In modern soil science, precision agriculture, is a major theme. We can be very specific with how we solve the challenges we encounter in our systems. But I invite you to broaden your experience, go beyond the specificity, and occasionally ask, what does the land need from me? So before we begin with talking about soil, restoring soil, building living compost, I want to start with basically a definition of what soil is. So I want to get a sense of what soil means to you. So please feel free to share them in the chat. What does soil mean to you? Maybe I'll give everyone 30 seconds to write down uh, how they define soil. No takers yet? All right, that's fine. I'm just going to go ahead and continue. Here's one definition. Soil is an ecological system. It is a community of living organisms merged with the non-living components, acting as a system. So with soil, it is a community, right? A community of living things that interact with the non-living components. Here's a more thorough definition. Soil is an ecological system. It is the outermost layer of the Earth's crust, marked by living creatures. It is the site of intensive exchange of matter and energy among air, water, and rocks. The soil, as a part of the ecosystem, occupies the key position in the global cycles of substances. So, in other words, soil is complex, and we should not shy away from this complexity. We deal with complexity all the time. All the relationships we have in our lives, they're all complex. When we interact with the land, when we interact with the soil, I think that it's time for us to appreciate the complexity that is going on in the soil. So here on the left is a diagram that provides a visual understanding of the definition that I just told you about in the earlier slide. So let's go through and basically break down that definition. So the soil, the pedosphere, is the outermost layer of the Earth's crust marked by living creatures. It is the site of intensive exchange of matter and energy among air, water, and rocks. The soil, as part of the ecosystem, occupies the key position in the global cycles of substances. So it's a dynamic interface between the lithosphere, the rock. So this is where you'll find your soil minerals, your sand, silt, and clay fractions. You have the atmosphere. Gases interact with soil and vice versa. We have the hydrosphere. This is the water, soil water, the biosphere as well, the living things. So it's a multifunctional crossroad. It's where everything meets. When we look at the inner circle, so we have the pedosphere here, surrounded by these different components that interact with soil. When we look within the circle, as a system, soil is made up of solid, liquid, and gas constituents. It's not just sand, silts, and clays. It's not just soil minerals. The mineral and organic constituents form the skeleton of the pedosphere, the solid component. This component interacts with the lithosphere, the solid outer part of the earth, and the biosphere, the zone of life on earth. The soil solution, this is the liquid component. It's more mobile. It transports nutrients. Here we have the interaction with the hydrosphere. This is the domain that includes water on the surface of the planet, underground, and in the air. The soil air, the gaseous component, represents the interface between the soil environment and the atmosphere. And at the core of everything, we have the living organisms. We'll focus a bit more on this integral piece throughout the rest of the session. So who are these living organisms? Here we'll find bacteria, we'll find fungi, we'll find algae, plant roots are one of them, the protozoas. We have different types of nematodes. We have bacterial feeding nematodes, fungal feeding nematodes, some nematodes that feed on plant roots. We have parasitic fungal nematodes. We have predatory mites, microarthropods, springtails, mites, and all these other soil animals that we can see with the naked eye, your earthworms, your millipedes, your centipedes, your sow bugs, ants. All of these organisms participate in one way or another in the evolution and formation of soil, especially the organic fraction. So one thing I do want to encourage you in your system is to look for soil creatures on the land that you are managing. Are you seeing beetles? Are you seeing earthworms? Are you seeing millipedes, arthropods in your system? How many different types are you seeing? So it's good to take note of these observations when you're out there working with your plants, or when you're out there asking your land what it needs from you. Soil is one of the most diverse habitats on the earth and contains one of the most diverse assemblages of living organisms. So here's a similar but a slightly different way to look at soil. Soil is made up of a mixture of different materials in varying proportions. We have the mineral matter, your rocks. Again, these are your sand, silts, and clays. Your organic matter, living organisms, your biota, as well as water and air. The solid components are made up of the minerals, your organic matter, and biota, the living organisms. So the composition of this component on the left-hand side will highly influence how the soil functions. Intensively managed landscapes, the ones that are constantly being tilled, have very little biology, active biology, and in some cases have low organic matter. The pores are the spaces between the solid soil particles. So here we have different aggregates. You see the pores here. These are filled with water and air and soil organisms as well. So soil, air, and water influence this network of pores. This network aerates or ventilates the soil. When water enters the soil, this network of aeration becomes blocked. The water allows nutrients to be transported through the soil. So think of this network like highways, right? And it allows food to travel through this network. When water leaves, air comes in, providing oxygen to aerobic microorganisms and plant roots. So soil air and soil water are interrelated and are dynamic parts of the soil. So this is data borrowed from USDA, NCRS, or Natural Resources Conservation Service. This leftmost column shows the grouping of different soil organisms, the majority of which are microscopic. So those are your bacteria, your fungi, your protozoa, your nematodes. And the columns that run along at the top compares the biomass of each group between each of these ecosystems. So if you look at bacteria, for instance, it's pretty much even throughout the ecosystem, right? So agricultural, prairie to forest, you're seeing about 100 million to 1 billion bacterial biomass per teaspoon of soil. Fungi, this is where you start to see things change. In an agricultural system, there are several yards of arbuscular mycorrhiza or AM dominant. These are the groups of fungi that are obligate symbionts, meaning they have or they need the host in order to survive. A lot of our vegetables associate themselves with this group of fungi. In forest ecosystems, however, this is where you're seeing more of the ectomycorrhizal fungi. These types of fungi are they form fruiting bodies. The majority of them form fruiting bodies called mushrooms. So this is where you'll see your ballets, your chanterelles, your truffles, your matsutakis. With the soil or land that you're managing, you should at least see some of these organisms here at the bottom that are visible to the naked eye, your arthropods, right? You should be able to see some springtails, some mites, beetles, millipedes, sow bugs, spiders, centipedes, and a variety of them. A lot of these organisms are what we call ecosystem engineers. They break up organic matter into fragments that can be further decomposed by organisms like bacteria and fungi. So they help build little cities in the soil. So bend down, take a look. Who's hanging out in your soil? So for instance, earthworms, right? Per square foot of earthworms, you should at least see 5 to 30 earthworms in an agricultural soil. Higher numbers when you have good levels of organic matter. All right, so when we talk about ecology, we acknowledge dynamic events, active relationships, and the players in soil. We acknowledge that there are a lot of interactions that take place between the different types of soil organisms, between the soil organisms and the plants, and between the soil organisms, the plants, and their environment. So soil is not a static medium. There's a lot going on that we still don't quite understand. We are actually just finding things out now that we didn't know even existed. So before I move on to the next section of my presentation, does anyone have any questions so far? Feel free to, Georgia, I'm not sure if it's okay for me to suggest unmuting if participants want to speak up and ask questions when it's question time. Is that okay if they want to do that? Okay, perfect.
Yeah, for sure. I think whatever people feel comfortable with. Yeah.
Awesome. And if you feel like you want to ask questions in the chat box, I'll try my best to answer them and get to them in time. All right, so no questions yet. So we just went through a very high level definition of soil as an ecological system. So now it's almost time for us to step back and, you know, and basically see it more than just sand, silts, and clays. We are now going to explore organic matter. What is organic matter? And one of the ecological services in soil called decomposition and its relationship with organic matter. So I believe this is an essential subject that all of us that grow food need to understand as part of our management practices. So what is decomposition? How does it work? Why is decomposition important? And how can we support this process? Another group question for everybody here. What is decomposition? Can anyone define what it is? The breakdown of organic matter. Thanks, Georgia. The cycling of organic matter, perfect. The breakdown of something into its component parts, amazing. All true statements. Transformation, I really like that. Amazing. This is great. I think I can stop presenting now because everyone pretty much already understands what decomposition is. But let's go through the process anyway. So what is it? It is the breakdown or disappearance of organic matter. This process is a combined effort between soil fauna, right? Your soil fauna being your worms, your centipedes, which are predators of worms, springtails, mites, so your microarthropods and your macroarthropods. So it's a combined effort between those groups of organisms and soil microbes, which are your bacteria and fungi. It's a process in which nutrients enter the soil food web. So the other being plant roots. When we talk about restoring soil health, one of the things that we are trying to achieve is to restore the biological community that supports the growth of your crops so they can be healthy. So when we define healthy crops, we're really talking about resistance to disease, resistance to abiotic factors such as drought, right? Well-formed flowers, well-formed fruits, well-developed root system. Plants maintain their physiological characteristics as best as they can throughout its growth. So with Mother Nature, she has found a way to manage the cycling of nutrients by having another input, right? The other being root exudates. Unfortunately, I don't have time today to talk about the rhizosphere. I'd love to come back and talk more about the rhizosphere and nutrient cycling and the relationship between all of these different types of ecological services. But tonight I'm going to focus on decomposition, organic matter, and composting. So two ways in which nutrients enter the soil food web. So here is the soil food web. One, through the root exudates. The second, I wouldn't even call it a secondary input. I think they kind of go hand in hand, is through organic matter, decomposition of organic matter. Decomposition fuels formation of soil structures. So I will briefly talk about soil aggregation. Again, that's another topic that I would really like to discuss. However, I don't think I have much time today. So it's important for us to understand that plant growth is highly dependent on the process of decomposition. But how does decomposition work? The process works when the activities of soil fauna and microbes act on plants or on other organic detritus of varying quality constrained by the climate and soil properties. So let's break that down a little bit more. Substrates of varying quality. What is the quality of the organic residue that are being decomposed? And this is when we can start to think about the types of organic matter that you are using in your system. What is the quality of that organic matter? What are the different types of organic matter that you're using on your farm or your garden? Are you seeing efficient decomposition of organic matter? Say if you were to mulch your beds with recalcitrant organic matter, say wood chips, how long does it take for those wood chips to break down? How long does it take for the green material, if you are using it as mulch, to break down? How do they transform in your landscape? So when you're using things like alfalfa meals, bone meals, any type of plant residue, what do they look like? So again, with organic matter, they can be categorized in three ways. Labile organic matter. These are easily digested by soil microbes. We're talking about bacteria. So these are sugars and starches. Manures fall in this category. Your meals, your alfalfa meals, your bone meals, your feather meals, these are easily digested by bacteria. Molasses, sugars from plant roots are also labile. Recalcitrant organic matter, these are the ones that are harder to digest forms of organic matter and make up the support tissues of most plants, especially in woody plants. Lignins can only be utilized by certain specialized organisms like white rot fungi, your turkey tails, your oyster mushrooms, your shiitakes. And then we have the intermediate forms of organic matter. These are a mix of both labile and recalcitrant in their degradability. So your cellulose, which is a major constituent of plant cell wall. Temperature and moisture around decomposing plant material regulates the activity of soil biology. Decomposition is slowed down when it's cooler, but when there's more moisture and it's warmer, you get more decomposition. So when you take a plant like corn, the parts of that plant, its leaves, the stalk, the husk, the tassels, the seeds, they all break down at different rates. The leaves will break down quicker than the stalks because of its chemical structure. It's relatively simpler. So again, if you are going to be using cover crops in your system to improve your soil organic matter levels, I highly recommend using a diversity of crops in combination with biologically diverse amendments like compost, compost extracts, and compost teas, which I will talk about as part of this session. So ultimately, bacteria and fungi are considered to be the major decomposers. They are the final pathway in releasing the energy and nutrients in decomposing materials for another cycle of plant growth. But what makes microbes unique? Why are they the ultimate pathway? Both bacteria and fungi secrete enzymes. So these are proteins that help speed up metabolism, that digest organic matter residue or organic matter outside the cell and then absorb the soluble end products into their bodies. Bacteria and fungi secrete different enzymes depending on the chemical structure of the material that they need to decompose. So a couple of examples, they would secrete cellulase to digest cellulose, protease to digest protein, etc. So lignin, a main component of woody plant cells, requires multiple enzymes produced by mostly fungi, but also some bacterial species in order to fully degrade the material. So what happens to the process of decomposition in high input and highly mechanized landscapes? Another group question for everyone, so I can take a little break here.
Can you say it one more time, Joe?
What happens to the process of decomposition in high input and highly mechanized landscapes? Oops, did I just stop my share? Sorry, everybody. It slows down. It actually speeds up. It's compromised. Or I guess you could see it. Yeah, it slows down in a way that things don't decompose as well, but also things can decompose really, really fast. In any case, it's compromised. The process is compromised. The community of microbes and their habitat is destroyed and have not been allowed to recover in those types of management. So if you lack soil biological diversity because you've intensively tilled the ground for a long time, you may start to notice plant residue decomposition being very, very slow. George is right. If nobody's home, who's going to fragment and break down that material, right? If the bacteria and fungi are compromised, who's going to break down that material? So what happens when that's the case, right? The plant will be stressed. It's calling for cooperation or symbiosis, but nobody's there. So what can we do then? This is when we can start to implement different types of management practices, bringing back biology in order to ensure maintenance of good overall health within our landscape. So we need to start essentially replenishing the microbiome of your soil. Kathy says it limits the decomposition. Katie says breaks up the process. Absolutely. Thank you, everybody. So a few minutes, or maybe I'll just spend a minute. I'll just put this up here for maybe about, yeah, max 1 minute, and then share in the chat while I continue on with the presentation. Essentially, list one practice you're currently doing to support the process of decomposition, and list one or two practices you would like to incorporate or improve to support the process of decomposition. Again, decomposition is one of the means to return nutrients back into the soil. So what is one thing that you're currently doing, and what is one thing that you want to improve? Kathy says adding compost. Perfect. Biomass layering. Perfect. Thank you, Lara. I hope I'm pronouncing your name right. So how can we support the process of decomposition? Winter cover crops from Georgia, no-till from Laura, thank you. Looks like I pronounced your name correctly. Cover crops, compost, wood chips. Katie, we use mulches with some crops, slice crops and leave roots, cover crops, add compost. Catherine, mulching is currently being done. Perfect. Rachel, adding compost, low till. Great, thank you so much. So how can we support the process of decomposition, increase the diversity above and below ground? We want to diversify the plant, right? Plant roots provide a lot of food for soil biology. They provide different types of exudates. They can provide, depending on the plant, they have different qualities and composition of exudate. So diversifying plants above ground by incorporating cover crops, growing cover crops with your cash crop are all good ways to support the process of decomposition, as well as diversifying soil biology below ground. So making sure that it's not just bacteria present in the soil. You also want to reduce disturbance as much as possible, though there are some cases where you may need to till, but give and take, right? Keep the soil covered and incorporating native plants. Native plants have the means to harness indigenous microorganisms as well. So having those set of organisms wake up are all very good ways to support the process of decomposition. Laura, leaving roots in when harvesting, perfect. Charlotte, cover cropping, multi-year rotations. Wonderful. Thank you, everybody. Okay, so why is decomposition important? Again, it provides habitat for beneficial soil invertebrates, your worms, your nematodes, your arthropods. These organisms help perform nutrient cycling. Many of them indirectly contribute to the decomposition process. It fuels formation of soil structure, and it promotes the suppression of diseases, pests, and pathogens. When we have diverse organisms present in soil, they can help keep the system in check, right? By consuming, inhibiting problematic organisms. So as an example, springtails are much more common in places where there's a lot of more woody material, moist woody material, but they can also feed off of Botrytis cinerea, which is gray mold that feed off grapes and a few other plants as well. It helps us reduce our dependency on chemical inputs. We don't have to spend that much money to buy fertilizers because it's a process where nutrients re-enter the soil food web system, keeping this community alive, right? When we keep this community alive, we're encouraging nutrient cycling, also known as the poop cycle. It's responsible for the creation of different forms of organic matter. So this is a nice segue to talk about organic matter. What is organic matter, right? So let's break down this diagram here a little bit more. Organic matter is the sum of all naturally and thermally altered, biologically derived organic materials found in the soil or on all the soil or on the soil surface. So it's largely made up of carbon and is any material that originated from living organisms. Soil organic matter, as I mentioned earlier, they can be categorized between labile, as far as their degradability rates, labile, recalcitrant, and intermediate. But they can also be categorized this way, right? We have the living organic matter, and we have the non-living organic matter on the right. The living organic matter on the left, we're talking about living tissues of plant origin or phytomass, microbial biomass, and faunal biomass. So organic materials associated with living soil organisms, associated with living soil animals, we're talking about their secretions and their excretions, right? Soil animals also shed their exoskeleton. So these are all materials that become part of the organic matter matrix. On the right-hand side, we have different subcategories for non-living organic matter. Dissolved organic matter, these are anything that is less than 0.45 micrometers in diameter in size. Particulate organic matter, these are the ones that you're probably more familiar with. Organic fragments with a recognizable cellular structure. So this is where your litter comes in, right? Organic materials located at the soil surface and devoid of identify what the organic matter looks like. This is where you're, when you're, say, mulching using your cover crops, you could still see the leaves that you're adding onto the soil. That's where it would be categorized under this particulate organic matter. Macroorganic matter, fragments of organic material greater than 50 micrometers in diameter. Light fraction, these are materials separated from soils by flotation. So anything that's just moving around or floating around. Humus, this is the nutrient bunker, as I like to call, how topsoil becomes your nutrient source, right? So humus are materials that are no longer identifiable with the naked eye. You need an instrument in order to identify what they are. So they're pretty broken down, and these materials associate themselves with your clay or fine silt fractions. Promoting this subcategory of organic matter also help build your soil aggregates, which are the basic units of soil structure. Here we have your non-humic biomolecules and your humic substances. So you have your polysaccharides, your proteins, your waxes, your lignin, as well. Here under humic substances, you've got your fulvic acids, oleic acids, humic, humin, crinic acids, different types of materials that can be bound to organic matter or mineral particles in the soil. And then we have inert organic matter, highly carbonized organic materials, including charcoal and charred plant materials. These are materials you'd find in an area where, say, a forest fire just blew through. So even with organic matter, there's diversity, right? But in order to get this diversity of organic matter in your soil, you need diverse soil organisms. You need bacteria and fungi. You need things that eat the bacteria and fungi, and so on. It's also important to remember that organic matter has multifaceted roles in soil. It impacts the physical, the biological, and the chemical properties of your soil. And at the same time, they don't occur in isolation. So what this means is that when organic matter influence the physical structure, or say the chemical structure, say you're adding soluble fertilizers, you are changing the biomass and the diversity of the living community in your soil. So when it influences the chemical, it will affect the biological, it will affect the physical. So how did we screw up decomposition? We've degraded topsoil, which is essentially is the A horizon. This is where the humic or the humus category of the non-living organic matter is found, the nutrient bunker, right? The A horizon is essentially topsoil. This is where the harder to decompose organic material is stored. It's kind of like your savings account, right? Um, your O horizon, or the easily soluble materials or organic matter, that's your checking account. That is what your plants are going to get right now. That's what your cash crops need at this very moment. Whereas your savings account, anything that's in the topsoil, that's saved for later. So when the checking account runs out, your soil will start to borrow from the savings account. So we've degraded topsoil and used up soil organic matter because of high input and intensive agricultural practices like tillage, chemical inputs, leaving soil bare, monocrops, land conversion, converting land from forest to agriculture. These types of practices cause problems with our crops. Not only that, but we also end up creating work for ourselves by having to mimic the process of decomposition, right? How do we mimic decomposition? We add fertilizers, right? We're not very good at adding fertilizers. We don't know what the plants need at any given moment in time. The plants can dictate for themselves what they need, right? All our role is to facilitate the growth of our crops. Again, we can't just have bacteria. We need to have different types of fungi. We need to have their predators. So you have your protozoas, you have your nematodes. We need microarthropods in our systems. These are your springtails and your mites. Microarthropods, they crush, they grind, they break down organic matter so that it makes it easier for bacteria and fungi to grow on the surfaces of that organic matter and do their job at breaking it down even further. Any questions so far before I move on to the next slide, which is composting? If you do have questions, just put them in the chat. I am just going to continue with the session. All right. Biological amendments, compost, a form of unconscious banditry, has been in operation. The property of generations to come in the shape of soil fertility has been used not to benefit the human race as a whole, but to enrich a dishonest present. Such a system cannot last. The career of the prodigal must come to an end. A new civilization will have to be created in which various reserves in the earth's crust are regarded as a sacred trust, and the food needed is obtained not by depleting the soil's capital, but by increasing the efficiency of the earth's green carpet. By Sir Albert Howard, The Soil and Health, a study of organic agriculture. So Sir Albert Howard has been called the father of modern composting. He went to India as an agriculture advisor to teach about Western agricultural practices. But when he got there, he realized that the people of India could actually teach him more. So he preferred Indian farming practices over conventional agriculture. And he refined the Indian composting system into what is now known as the indoor method. That's INDORE. Many of the modern composting systems we know now came from this work. All right. I'm sure a lot of you already use compost, but I'd like to know how many of you make your own compost. Why do you compost, and what does composting mean to you? So feel free to share anything in the chat about your composting woes, um, maybe good sources of compost. If you could share any good sources of compost to anyone else, please feel free to do so. So what is compost? It's a result of an aerobic decomposition process exhibiting amending, fertilizing character, and contains diverse soil organisms. That last part is extremely important. Compost is not only about returning organic matter into the soil, it's also about bringing back the organisms to replenish the life system of the land. Think of it as your pre and probiotic, right? Using compost is replenishing the microbiome of your soil. So this is especially useful when the soil had been excessively tilled for many years and the biological diversity of that soil is pretty much gone. We don't compost our own material, but do buy it in. Thank you, Rachel. Katie, we compost, but have to bring so much in to support the farm, looking for more effective methods of producing high quality, perfect compostees on small scale farm. Absolutely. And I'm going to go through that material here pretty soon. Made compost in the past, but had problems with rats. The thing with composting as well is you need to interact with it, right? Where are we at here? As a composter, my job is to make sure that the biology that I'm growing or farming in my compost have adequate water, food, and oxygen. So even if you're making a static pile, I highly recommend interacting with it every 2 to 3 days, if you can. If you can. No pressure though, or even just once a week. I know that farmers, especially intensive production systems, don't have time to manage that part of their system. But if you can, just visit it once or twice a week, making sure that it's aerated. You don't have to turn it, just poke around in it, making sure that you're dislike making a home in areas where their home is constantly being disrupted. Okay, so composting again is an aerobic decomposition of organic matter aided by the activity of a complex food web. So here again, my job as a composter is to facilitate the decomposition process. I'm not decomposing the material, I'm just facilitating the process. What is composting? Applying biologically diverse compost is a means to effectively replenish the soil microbiome and restore the complex processes within the rhizosphere. I didn't get to talk about the rhizosphere today, but the rhizosphere is the region around plant roots where there's a lot of activity. There's a lot of bacteria, fungal activity within that region of roots because the plants are feeding the soil and the microorganisms are feeding off of that material, thereby attracting the different predators that could potentially be present in the soil. This is what I'm noticing. A lot of heavily depleted soils lack the fungal biomass. They also lack diverse predatory organisms, and they have very weak aggregates as well, right? So with soil biology and understanding the effective means on how you can apply compost at a scale that is more efficient, then it's gonna really take you far as your production goes. You can start to rebuild that biology in even after 3 growing seasons. Just give it time. Our vegetables tend to prefer fungal to bacterial mass ratio of 0.75. So what that means is 0.7 parts of fungi. So that's microgram per gram of soil for every 1 microgram of gram of soil of bacteria. If you're seeing a lot of weeds in your system, you're pretty much in this category here. There's 0.1 parts fungi for every 1 part of soil. Vegetables that tend to prefer this fungal to biomass ratio are your basically everything but brassicas. Brassicas, so your cole crops, your cabbages, your cauliflowers, your broccolis, they have compounds that they exude from their plant roots that do not allow mycorrhizal fungi to basically enter the root system. So they do prefer a lower fungal to biomass ratio.
So I have a quick question. I see some of them have colons, like their ratios, but then some are periods. Can you explain a little bit more the 0.75?
Oh yeah, that's just 0.75. That's just a ratio. So 0.75 micrograms per gram of fungi of soil. So 0.75 parts of fungi for every 1 part bacteria. Does that make sense? So they didn't put the 1 on the right hand side because it was sort of redundant for them, I guess. So what it is this 0.75 pertains to the fungal biomass for every 1 part bacteria. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does.
Okay.
Really a
Okay.
lot of fungi.
Yes,
That's
yes, for sure.
yeah.
And we're talking about saprotrophic fungi here too, meaning the fungal biomass that help break down, that are mostly decomposer fungi, not just mycorrhizal fungi that we're talking about. Okay, so I kind of glossed over this because I'm running out of time, and I really would like to get into the teas and extracts portion of the section. I think this could really benefit um, everybody here. So if you have any questions, I believe you have. I'm not sure if everyone has my email, but I'll try my best to answer your question when I can. I'll share my email as well in the chat later on. So with composting, it's a way of facilitating decomposition with the aid of organisms. Many folks refer to composting as waste reduction. I don't particularly like to use that term because I don't see the materials as waste. I see it as a resource. If the perspective is waste, you're just going to get garbage in, garbage out. So that's not what composting is in my definition. So if the perspective is resource, you may treat the materials with greater respect. We can produce something valuable out of the materials. They are handled and managed in a way where the end product provides more value than the individual raw materials themselves. So when we compost, we are playing a part in cycling nutrients back to the soil. Why is it important? We're rebuilding soil community lost from mismanagement. We are supporting natural soil processes such as nutrient cycling and water regulation, purification, and storage. And it reduces our dependency on off-farm inputs, therefore reducing growing costs. And we can grow healthier plants because we're supporting the soil community that help feed our plants. So ideally, the ingredients that you use for your compost comes from your farm or somewhere in your local area. So you also proliferate the indigenous microorganisms present in your region. Are all composts made of the same quality or of the same quality? Absolutely not. The ingredients that you use, how you manage the temperature and moisture of your compost, and the time of the year that you're composting will affect the quality of your compost pile. So key practices here, always use diverse ingredients. A compost pile that has 50% horse manure and 50% straw will have very limited biological activity or diversity compared to compost that contains manure, straw, hay, grass, orchard trimmings, wood chips, etc. Temperature and moisture, how you manage these two variables will also determine the quality of your compost. When it's too dry, biology can slow down. When it's too wet, you may encourage undesirable organisms in your pile. So you start to create anaerobic conditions in your pile. When you get anaerobic conditions, you start to produce gases. The soluble nutrients will basically transform into gases and acids as well, which are detrimental to plant roots. And the season, which time of the year are you composting? Right? Spring season, if you start to compost now, a lot of the plants are waking up. Perennial plants, for instance, they store their energy in the wintertime around their root system. They start to produce the above ground parts. And when you mow that stuff down or when you cut them down and use them in your compost pile, then that's a lot of energy. Your pile may heat up faster that way, right? Compared to when you're composting in later fall or late summer. Okay, so how do you check the compost's quality? When you buy compost or make compost, we use our senses. A lot of folks don't have microscopes. I use microscopes for my clients that need to understand the biological community in their compost. If you don't have one, use your senses. Your body tells you a lot. It's got to be dark brown, not black. If it's black, it's gone anaerobic, meaning that you're basically just putting in putrefied organic matter in your soil. And it's got to be about 70% cocoa chocolate bar in color. If you plan to shop for compost in your local region, bring chocolate with you. 70% chocolate is the best. Your sense of smell, it's got to smell like forest floor. No stinky stuff. when you're smelling ammonia, formaldehyde, sulfur, that's all anaerobic indicators. So when you're smelling stink in a compost pile, you're losing nutrients. If the compost has no smell, it has no life. Your sense of touch, it's got to be fluffy. Fluffy's good. That means the compost has passageways and airways, which will allow oxygen and water to penetrate through. Okay. Okay, so right now I am working with a handful of farmers throughout BC that are trying to refine their composting process. Essentially, I'm helping them tweak the way they compost so that they are growing microorganisms, diversity in their compost piles, so they can use that material in their fields as an inoculant. So here's an example. This chart was just recently put together from a compost that was submitted by farmers out in Black Creek, BC. They are turkey farmers. It shows here how compost management and feedstock influence the fungal biomass in a compost pile. So on the bottom left, minimum desired, that's the minimum biomass that we want to look for fungi per gram of soil. So how many micrograms per gram of soil? This is the minimum. March, September, Thanksgiving, and Christmas. These are all just compost IDs. So they sent me a sample of their compost in March of last year, another one in September of last year. They sent me just recently a Thanksgiving compost that they made a week ago, and a Christmas compost pile as well. As you can see here, the fungal biomass of the Thanksgiving compost pile is a lot higher than the rest of the compost piles that they've produced on their farm. Another thing with these farmers is that they send me logs. They send me ways, a lot of detail. They put down a lot of detail. We look at temperature. We look at the ingredients that they're using, and looking at how they're managing both as part of their composting process. So the idea is to encourage more diversity of, say, the fungal groups in their compost pile. So this spring, we are going to be using the Thanksgiving compost as their fertilizer. This is going to be their soil inoculant. And another thing too with these farmers is that because they're turkey farmers, they also process their own meat on the farm. They have their own abattoir, and they get a lot of turkey organs and turkey litter. So you can just imagine the group of organisms. I don't know if this is probably a group question. Can anyone guess what group of organisms would flourish with those types of feedstock? So we're talking turkey organs and turkey litter. So if we're looking at bacteria and fungi, which group of organisms would flourish more in that feedstock? So feel free to just write it in the chat. So on top of looking at the fungal biomass, we also looked at their amoeba population. Bacteria, yes, that is correct. Right. So if you look at sorry, I'm going back here. I'm looking at the chat. Rachel and Catherine, you're both right. Bacteria is the group of organisms that you're encouraging when you're using meat parts or meat poop, or sorry, livestock, basically, right? Livestock parts. Chickens, you got your cows, you got your horses. It's also good to understand what those animals are eating, right? So if you're using cow manure as part of your production system, it's good to understand where you're getting that manure from. If it's from a dairy farmer where they've just recently, say, gave their cows antibiotics, it sort of makes you think and wonder what the diversity of organisms are going to look like in that cow manure. So on top of fungal biomass, we looked at the amoeba. These are predators of bacteria. There's also diversity of amoeba in their soil. So this belongs to the protozoa group. Again, the Thanksgiving pile exceeded the minimum desired, and it exceeded the numbers compared to the other piles that they've created on their farm. Nematode comparison. These are, so you have your minimum desire, the yellow, March pile, September pile, Thanksgiving pile, and the Christmas pile. It's also grouped by function. So the nematode functional group, we have nematodes that feed on bacteria. We have nematodes that feed on fungi, nematodes that feed on other nematodes, nematodes that feed on plants, and the total beneficial. So basically everything but the plant feeding nematodes. As you can see, again, the Thanksgiving pile exceeded everything else. So this is definitely what we are going to use as part of our soil remediation process this year. I'm going to quickly share a video of what, I hope I can find my Zoom screens here because there's a lot of screens in front of me and I don't want to accidentally stop this presentation. Okay, so I just want to quickly share a video of what one of the organisms look like that we found or that I found in their compost. This one here. So this is a bacterial feeding nematode, a fairly large bacterial feeder. It's still loading on my end. So if you're not seeing it on your end, no worries. It's loading it on my end. It looks like it may not work, everyone. I'm sorry. I'm having some internet issues today. But hopefully it'll, oh, there you go. There you go. So this is a bacterial feeding nematode. It's fairly large. It's still loading. It was the thing with the compost pile that they made in Thanksgiving is the diversity of the nematodes that I found as well. It's not just this one nematode. They had at least 3 to 4 different species of nematodes in their compost pile. When there's diversity of organisms, you can just imagine the diversity of bacterial species that they feed on, because they can be picky eaters as well. Here's another example of a nematode that can be found in a compost pile. Once it loads, I'll let you. There you go. So these are what are considered omnivores. So anything that fits in their mouth becomes food for them. They can feed on bacteria. They can feed on fungal spores. Some scientists have found them feeding on amoeba. So when we encourage these types of organisms in our soil, we're encouraging nutrient cycling as well.
Joe, there are a couple questions in the chat too, whenever you think it's a good time to answer them.
Okay, so Charlotte asked, would you ideally want to see other types of nematodes in that sample as well? Absolutely. The goal really is to, I mean, we may not be able to have the proper diversity of, say, the fungal feeding nematodes or the nematodes that feed on other nematodes. We may not be able to make that happen in the compost pile. That's totally okay. What matters is having other groups of nematodes, those nematodes present in the soil. They could just be dormant, or maybe there are other areas on your farm that have been left alone for many years, and there are nematodes there that you can't quite bring in your compost. They can't find their way to the compost pile, but they may find their way into your soil, into the areas where you are planting your crops. What did the farm do in order to have success with their Thanksgiving compost? So that was a question from Katie. Really good question. One of the things that I highly encourage them to do is to partner up with arborists in their local area. In the beginning, we had to find basically a bunch of arborists that are working close to them. The arborists have to dump their wood chips somewhere. and they have to pay a fee to dump it somewhere. So basically, they made an agreement that the arborists just come and dump it on their farm whenever they can. It's gotten to that point where the farmers are like, okay, I have enough wood chips. I think that's good for now. So they are able to make those connections with other businesses in their area. Okay, compost extracts and teas. I'm gonna quickly go through this. I only have 15 minutes left. Do you make extracts or teas? Please feel free to add them or to answer the question in the chat. One thing I want everyone to remember is this: the quality of your compost extract and tea is determined by the quality of your base ingredient, which is your compost. Why make it? Like compost, it helps amend the soil, they fertilize the plants, and they contain diverse soil biology. The only difference with this method of inoculant is that it's distributed in a liquid form. Why not just spread compost? What's the difference between spreading compost and applying extracts or teas? In a lot of ways, spreading biology and plant available nutrients in a liquid form is more feasible for many farmers and gardeners. Some folks just don't have enough material to make, say, 34 cubic yards of biologically rich compost for their 1 acre farm, right? So that's about a quarter of an inch thick of compost spread out onto the soil. Making extracts and teas help if you cannot make enough solid material. Again, this is really important. The quality of your extract and tea is determined by the quality of your base ingredient, which is your compost. You have to have good quality compost in order to have a good quality inoculant. So you saw earlier with the compost piles that the farmer had analyzed or helped, or that I analyzed. The Thanksgiving pile is by far the best compost they made on their farm. So that's what we're going to use as their inoculant, not the Christmas compost pile. What's the difference between extracts and tea? A compost extract, it's a process of extracting the organisms and soluble nutrients from compost. A compost tea is a process of brewing a water extract of compost and adding food supplements to encourage the growth of beneficial organisms. So here's the difference between them. Compost tea is a foliar application. You're growing organisms. Therefore, when organisms are growing in a compost tea, organisms being bacteria and fungi, they make glues. And those glues are what's going to help them stick to the above ground parts of the plant. Compost extract, this is a soil application. We want to target the root system of the plant. Compost tea, you add foods at the start of the brew to grow your organisms, whereas an extract, you can add it before you apply it onto the soil. Compost tea, microbes are activated and are grown. Glues that they produce help them stick to above ground surfaces of plants. Extracts, microbes don't grow. You get whatever you get from your compost. Teas generally used to prevent disease-causing organisms or pests on the above ground parts of the plant. An extract, it's an effective means to get beneficial organisms into the root zone. Teas can also be used in soils with organic matter levels that are below 3%. So foods are added and dead organism bodies in the brew acts as organic matter. Whereas for extract, you have to have organic matter levels that are greater than 5% in your soil. Main principles for extracts and teas: quality compost, it's got to be aerobic, and the quality of your water. It's totally okay to use chlorinated water as well. I'm going to skip these slides. These are just reports that I made for 2 different clients, and it was just an exercise to see which compost you would use. So what are some foods that you can add in your extracts or teas? I highly recommend using fish hydrolysate, not fish emulsion. Fish hydrolysate is cold processed. It's all cold processed all the way from start to finish. The enzymes that break down the fish and the oils of the fish are still in the product. So oils serve as fungal foods, whereas emulsions are heat treated, thereby you're losing most of the foods that are valuable to both the microbes and the plants. Cold processed seaweed kelp is another one. Feather meal is an easily decomposable food. I would not use feather meal in a tea. I may add it in an extract. Bone meal and blood meal, same, very high nitrogen sources, especially the blood meal. This is more of a phosphorus source. Blood meal, I would not put it in a tea, nor would I do it for the bone meal. I would just use these supplements, I call them microbial supplements, in an extract. So most producers already have sprayer equipment at their disposal. The only thing that you want to make sure of is that it's conducive to spraying your biology. You got to have the right pump. Venturi or diaphragm pump are the two choices that are recommended. No centrifugal pumps. Centrifugal pumps have parts in them that could destroy the biology. How are others making compost tea? We bubble sacks of compost bubbled for 24 hours and injected with a fertigation system. That's a question for everyone, I think. All right, so applying biology, some examples. Aeration is important. Here is I'm going to show you some examples of clients that have started their own biological system on the farm. This was put together by a flower farmer in Port Moody called Sea Breeze Florals. So we started working together last year. We built her first thermophilic compost pile. We are going to use that compost pile as an inoculant. So we're going to start to make extracts and teas with it. This is the setup that she was able to put together. I basically sold her my old pump. I don't know if you saw that in the early, you can only see the 12 valve system, but your pump has to provide proper aeration. I need to see bubbling on the surface of that water. That bubbling is what's going to push the organisms out of the compost material into the water and provide that aeration. So you're not running into anaerobic conditions in your compost tea. Compost teas are very easy to screw up because you are adding foods and you're growing bacteria. You could be growing a lot of bacteria that your system can't replenish the oxygen in the water fast enough. So she has these 3 buckets, 3 5-gallon buckets. Yeah, I think I'm really looking forward to working with this system this year. Here are others that I want to share with you. So this one was the first picture that I accidentally pulled up. This is a 135-gallon brewer. That's about 550 liters. It comes with a pump at the bottom here. Hopefully you can see that. Comes with a pump at the bottom. It also comes with a diaphragm pump. This unit was purchased from the US. Unfortunately, we don't have assembled units here in Canada. The only unit that, well, you have to buy the parts separately and assemble it yourself. You could get the tank at a distributor here called Bar Plastics. They sell the tank and they sell the stand for the tank. You'd have to buy or purchase the air pump separately as well. And then you have to come up with a rig at the bottom to make sure that you're providing aeration into the water up top. Here is a sprayer. So we started working with the sprayer at the turkey farm. It's a boom sprayer. It's just pulled by their tractor. They were having one of the things you want to make sure of is your sprayer, the nozzles are big enough so your biology can go through, right? And all the filters are pretty much removed from the sprayer itself so that your equipment isn't clogging. Here is a sprayer from Little Dog Farm, another client that I'm working with over in Creston. Um, I'm just going to put this on repeat. They are basically turning a heavily degraded landscape into an orchard system. So they want to start producing cider on their farm. Ian had to get this rig manufactured in the US because we just don't have the proper sprayers here in Canada that is suitable for his context. Um, yeah, he basically put in cover crops at the beginning of the year last year, and then the heat wave came and all the cover crops died. And this was fall of last year. We made compost on his farm, and he already had some compost before, so we used the compost that he had created or produced as an inoculant. And we had to check the biology of the compost, and we had to check the biology coming out of the sprayer, making sure that the nematodes are actually going through. Here is a brewer that was rigged by the same client, Little Dog. So the same brewer as you saw with the turkey farmers earlier. But what they did was they lifted it up off the ground and built a scaffold and took advantage of gravity to feed basically their inoculant into their sprayer system. Okay. So what are the consequences of rebuilding your soil biology? Here's a picture of one of the fields at the turkey farm out in Black Creek. So I received an email from the client about one of his fields that we're monitoring last year. We're still monitoring it this year. So we're back at it again. His email pretty much said, we had good rain over the past few days and there's no ponding. Usually there would be a pool in the middle of the field. So for decades, this field would hold so much water on top that it takes 4 to 5 days of absolutely no rain for the water to percolate. So to begin rebuilding soil, Walter Yenny, who's an Australian soil microbiologist, recommends adding nothing. So by this, he means increasing cathedrals of voids. So you saw earlier the pores, the highways between the different soil aggregates. That's what you want to add in your soil, are the pores. You're adding nothing. So we focused last year on adding nothing by restoring the soil's structure, seeing the stark change in one of the fields after one growing season indicated that we are on the right path of our remediation process. So typically fields that have been intensively tilled are highly compacted, they have weak aggregates, and water just isn't able to move anywhere. So what we did was we timed and layered our approach using mechanical decompaction. It's got to be timed. It's got to be done at the right time of the year. So we used a subsoiler in the late summer or early fall. The ground was so dry that it actually the client had some machine equipment issues because it broke the machine. It was so compacted. So we used mechanical decompaction, which I like to call a restorative disturbance. He also planted diverse cover crops, and we customized his biological applications. So I created a recipe for these clients based on the compost testing that we did, and provided them with the right amount of foods to add, how long to brew the teas and extracts for, and which compost they should really be using. So the great thing about this is Glenn sees no ponding, or the client sees no ponding, and not just one, but two of his fields. The heat wave definitely didn't help. Um, yeah, so that was a big issue for us. And finally, quickly, this is something that I just put together. I put this together for one of the workshops that I did earlier last year or late last year, is when to apply soil biology. So I want to focus on biological liquid application. Transplant, I highly recommend applying your extracts if you can when your seedlings are still small. When they're in your greenhouse growing, hit them up while they're babies with biology. You probably will have to dilute your extracts, which is totally fine, but it's good to get them while they're small. Build up the soil biology around their root system while they're in your greenhouse. And it's actually much more efficient that way because you're working in a much smaller scale. When you're seeding, you can apply extracts or teas in furrows below your seeds if you can. Apply extracts for plant maintenance. Apply teas on above ground parts for managing diseases. Bud break or bud burst. This is something that I would recommend, say, for your cauliflowers or for your broccolis. Once they start to flower, hit them with your extracts if you can, if you have time. This is just the guide. This is by no means this is what you got to do kind of thing. I know that with intensive production systems, sometimes soil management is understandably, it gets harder and harder when you have so many other things that you need to do on top of it. Some people do treatments of their seeds. Some people even do compost tea treatments on their cover plant seeds before they plant their cover crops. So they're increasing the microbiome of their seeds before they plant them into the soil.
So it might just be me, but what does EML stand for?
Oh, I am so sorry. I should have went through that. That's early, mid, and late.
Great, thank you.
No worries. And finally, I'm running out of time here. Here are a few wise words generously provided by one of my clients, Rachel. She was a farm manager responsible for the vegetable production aspect at Paradise Fields Farm in Binbrook, Ontario. They have a pretty diversified system, so they just don't grow vegetables. But these are really good advice or feedback. Have at least one designated person to take the reins and maybe another person to leave it all to in the case of someone leaving. Understand what your capacity is on your farm before incorporating this practice because it's time, it's money, and it's willingness to learn the process. If you're organized with knowing which day you will be mowing and tarping, it may be easier to coordinate your brews. Recognize that the BCS is counterproductive to what the biological composting tea and extract system is trying to accomplish. And then finally, all in all, it was so fun to learn about, and I think I can make a dramatic difference. If set up properly, it could be much smoother than it was for us. I could imagine after a first season, it gets easier and easier to incorporate. So the soil management practices, making really good compost, making really good extracts, it does take time. I'm not expecting everyone to incorporate all of these practices in one growing season. I highly recommend starting to think about it in the winter when things are a bit slow and starting to think about which management unit, which beds do you want to focus on. So instead of hitting the entire farm, focus on a small section of your farm where you're seeing low yield, where you're seeing more diseases come up, where you want things to improve just a little bit better, and experiment with that first before applying the entire practice on a larger scale. That said, I breezed through that. That's probably the fastest presentation I've ever had to do on soil biology. Thank you for joining me tonight. I'll stick around for a few more minutes if you have questions. Georgia, I'm not sure how you feel about that.
Yep, I'm okay to stay on if folks want to ask questions for sure.
Okay, great. Do you have any resources for making small batch teas and extracts for micro farmers? I will try and find some video resources. There are a lot on YouTube. I would recommend looking into Elaine Ingham. Oh, I'm losing you guys. Okay. Elaine Ingham, she is the president of Soil Food Web Inc. And she really started this entire understanding of the soil food web. And she was able to spread that message to a lot of folks out there.
Any other questions? You can feel free to unmute too.
I have one. Can you hear me, Georgia?
Yeah. Yeah. Hi, Charlotte.
Hi. Thanks, Joe. So I was just doing some thinking. I have a background in kind of ecology. Um, and you mentioned about there being kind of microbes that are more native to certain areas than others. And I guess, as with anything in farming, there must be a slight conflict of interest between kind of encouraging the microbes that are already there and adding in new ones. So, how do you balance that when you're creating compost and teas and extracts?
I try to use organic material that is grown locally. One of the projects that I'm doing right now is with a vineyard out in the Okanagan. And this project is encouraging more native plants to grow in between the vines, so between the grapes, and to encourage the microbes, the indigenous microorganisms. We also used native plants in our compost piles on top of everything else, on top of wood chips, straws, any kind of green component like the mark, which is the resource after processing the grapes. So we just mix it all in the compost pile and manage everything that way. Does that answer your question?
It does, yes. Is there ever kind of a bit of disappointment there? Do you ever find that like what would naturally be in the soil isn't perhaps encouraging what you want to grow there? I guess that might happen sometimes.
Yeah, I haven't ran into that situation yet. We'll see with this vineyard project because these extracts and teas are going to be applied on the grapes or around the grapes. Um, I can't see it being problematic because the soil itself is quite dead. The way vineyards, well, this particular vineyard anyway, the way that soils are managed, it's very managed in a sterile way or in a let's eliminate this disease kind of way, as opposed to let's support the health of the vines. So the perspective really needs to shift in that. I think we need to start uh, focusing on let's promote the health of the things that we want to grow, as opposed to let's eliminate the things that we don't want to grow. So I haven't yet ran into any problems, but uh, yeah, I think I have your email. I'll let you know if I do.
Thanks. I guess it's probably something that we just don't know that much about yet
Yeah,
as well.
for sure. It's a brand new. I can't really say it's this is a new thing, but in terms of the practical application, we are still finding out a lot at the moment. I hope that helps.
There's also a question from Katie Underwood about broadcasting compost tea through, I don't know how to pronounce it, Senninger wobbler heads.
Wobbler heads. It depends on do they have filters? So Katie, feel free to unmute yourself. Do these the I would assume that they connect to your irrigation lines. Is that correct? And
Hi, yeah,
hi.
they do. The filter system that I have is before the fertigation injection system. So I'm just wondering if I can, right now, before much goes onto the field, just do a big broadcast of a compost tea through my irrigation system.
Yeah, for sure. I would check the size of the filter first before running it through the fertigation system. Ideally, you want something that is larger than 400 micrometers as far as the filter size goes. That is 400 micrometer is the minimum size that you want for nematodes to go through, larger predatory nematodes anyway. And you also might want to check the end of the where the I guess you could say the size of that nozzle. You may run into some clogging issues. I recommend are you familiar with compost tea brew bags?
Yeah.
Okay, so if you want, you could experiment with using the compost brew bag as your filter before you put it into your fertigation system.
Okay,
So filter it through that first so that you're not allowing any particulates through. But the only thing I would recommend though is if you are going to start incorporating compost teas, because the idea of compost teas is also bringing back the organisms. If you can, I would recommend a biological soil analysis of before and after
okay,
of the
great.
soil. So see if you're actually seeing a difference in the soil community. But your plants will tell you that as well, how they're performing, right? How they are growing. So
Sure, thank you very
just as
much.
yeah, for sure.
You probably see
Um,
that question from Catherine too.
Yeah, will adding mulch and compost add nothing to soil without having to do a restorative? It depends on the compost. Without having to do a restorative. Can you elaborate on that, Catherine?
Sure, just we have a wetter site, and would we be able to just add methane, as you were saying earlier in the talk, through the addition of like mulch and compost? Will that just, over time, will that build enough porosity within the soil to help with water infiltration? Do you know what I mean?
Absolutely. As long as you, yeah, I know what you mean. As long as you're also encouraging plant roots throughout the year, if you can, living roots. Because you're adding mulch, you're adding compost, but plant roots also help with adding nothing to soil because they're helping break up those soil particles as well. Does that make
Right.
sense? And the quality of your compost too. I don't know where your compost comes from or if this compost that you make on your own. But just using your senses to understand whether or not your compost actually smells like forest floor. If you are making it yourself, you see different sizes of particles in your compost. You're using different ingredients. That's another thing that I highly recommend is diversify your ingredients and managing your moisture. Moisture is a huge factor that needs to be considered when you're managing your compost pile.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome. I hope that answered your question.
Yeah. For sure. Thanks.
Any other questions? I don't think so. It's hard to tell. It's the problem with the video off. I'm gonna share a paper in the chat because actually Cindy Prescott, who was here earlier, Joe, was one of my professors at UBC, and she teaches ecological restoration. And she did a session last year about speaking about similar topics as you and talked a lot about root exudates, and just talked so much about the importance of having living roots in the ground and how that is the habitat for all of those good things that you need to support healthy soils. And she actually published a paper on it, which I can email to you, but I'll also put it in here in the chat in case.
Awesome.
Yeah. But yeah, I think unless anybody else has questions, we can wrap it up. But thank you so much. That was really, really great. And I've recorded it. And so I'll send your slides out and the recording out to folks later this week. I think it takes a little while to process the recording. And yeah, if you feel comfortable, I can share your email, Joe.
Yes.
The emails. Okay, so I'll share Joe's email, and then if you have lingering questions, you can reach out to her as well. That was great. I feel like I was back at UBC in like an exciting soil science class.
Okay, I was gonna ask. I hope it wasn't in a boring kind of way, or
No, it wasn't. No, I just mean, well, I love learning about that stuff. But yeah, no, that was really excellent. And so, yeah, thank you so much for your time and for spending more time with us, asking those or answering those questions. And yeah, we'll be in touch soon. And yeah, I hope everyone has a good evening, and hope to see you at next week's climate friendly farming workshop as well. So thank you so much, Jo.
you're very welcome.